Hello everybody, welcome back to What's Up Doctor. Have you ever wondered what on earth is going on with scientific research? How many times do you see an article, hear something in the press about the fact that eating eggs are bad for you, eating eggs are good for you, too much coffee is bad for you, there's not enough coffee to drink, vitamin D is not good for you, doesn't really make a difference, vitamin D is amazing. Well, the question that I want to try and answer today is, how do we evaluate all of these things? How do we know what's good, what's not good, in what quantities? How's the research done? What are the factors that affect the way in which we think about these things? And how is science using methodology to appropriately answer these questions, and what are the influences? Looking at this pyramid, you'll see that expert opinion is often the thing that sparks off an idea, but what seems to drive a lot of research today is what's called a systematic review. So you're having a scientist or a group of scientists who are analyzing a lot of other data, and the result of this is actually that they are looking at the big data, but they might be missing very important details of treatments which may be incredibly effective, but which we'll never really find out much about because they're not really being researched into. I've got a bit of a problem with the way research is conducted today and the way it's published as well. In the 1940s, the mantra was to publish or perish, which means that a scientist needs to just keep publishing as much research as possible, and this is what got them known. This is the fact that gave them weight behind what they found and gave the prestige and would possibly spur on more science. Nowadays, the mantra has changed somewhat, whereby we are looking at the impact of scientific journals. So if a research article is published in a particular journal and it's cited, that means other people have quoted it many times. The more times that it's cited, the more the greater what's known as the impact factor is, and this is what determines how successful that research has been in promoting further scientific dialogue, further research, perhaps grant applications. It's comparable to likes on Facebook, which are like citations. So the more likes you get, the more people have actually noticed your article and have quoted it, and therefore you have been a success. The problem with that is that you're not really encouraging any really novel, innovative research, but rather you're just in a kind of echo chamber where everyone's saying, yes, like. What you want is some form of combination whereby novel research is actually coming through, where there are truly innovative ideas, or perhaps even old ideas that are actually being brought up to the surface because they've been forgotten. Now, there are a number of different factors involved in research publications that have problems within them. I'm going to go over a few of these. Before I get into the list, I'm going to mention a story about the discovery of a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. A number of years ago, nobody knew what caused stomach ulcers, and the most educated guess at the time was that it was stress, or perhaps drinking too much alcohol and spicy foods. And while these things are true, there was actually an underlying factor that people didn't realize in many, many cases. And this was that there's a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori in the stomach, which actually caused the development of stomach ulcers. Now, in order for this to be proven, the scientist who discovered it actually had to go as far as ingesting Helicobacter pylori himself, so that he could actually develop stomach ulcers, which he was then able to cure with antibiotic treatment. And this in itself was the start of the research that got noticed, and people then started to say, oh, This is not a crazy idea. This is actually a real thing. And now we know that up to 50% of the population by the age of 50 has Helicobacter. That doesn't mean that it always needs to be treated, but this is an incredibly important fact. The point of the story is that he was not so popular when he came up with this idea. In fact, many people thought he was just mad. Only once he had gone through proving this through self-experimentation did people start to actually pay attention to what he was saying. Today, such a thing rarely happens, but I want to argue that it really needs to start happening again. Maybe not exactly like that, but in other ways. And I'm going to talk about all the factors surrounding this. So first of all, there's something called citation bias. What's citation bias? It's what I was talking about just earlier. It's about the fact that the more publications are giving the likes to an article, and the more it's cited and passed around, therefore the more the research is seen as carrying weight, let's say. So the problem with citation bias is that you've got a lot of people just clicking like, and then the fact that there may be some really important piece of research somewhere in the other articles is actually being missed, and therefore we're kind of just in an echo chamber, as I said before. In the past, a scientist was far more curious and genuinely open to looking at the causes of disease or possible treatments, and so this curiosity was the thing that really drove science, and it resulted in many failures, but it did develop a lot of original ideas. If you look at the graphs, you'll see that science before the fact that there was such a thing as citation obsession involved a lot of different scientists going through stages of exploration, breakthrough, and an incremental advance in what we know about a subject. If you look at science today, you've actually got very few people doing exploratory ideas, very few with breakthroughs, and a lot of people just focusing on very small incremental advances in the knowledge once the knowledge has finally come out there and is thought to be meaningful. And the problem with citation bias is that the articles are read again and again and again and again, and the impression is that this is the treatment that works best, but that's only because the message has been rammed down everybody's throat for so long, rather than the fact that it has anything meaningful to compete with. So you're not seeing other meaningful competitors in terms of what the potential research would show had those other avenues been explored. So to come back to the echo chamber, what's not happening is that scientists are not sitting in a room or a virtual room and having meaningful discussions with opposing views, but rather they're trying to tweak little things to say, okay, well, this drug works like this. How about we just use a higher dose of the same drug? Or how about we use this drug with another drug? As opposed to going in an entirely different direction and questioning the basis of the original method or the original treatment or whatever the research subject be. Another problem is the way in which the research is actually written, and simple words such as including the word novel or innovative or amazing or breakthrough actually catches the eyes of the reviewers of these papers and makes it more likely that such a paper is going to reach to a journal or to a good journal. So you've actually got a kind of bias just from the language used in describing the effect of, let's say, a particular treatment. The problem being that the numbers don't necessarily back up the words. So you've immediately got a bias there, and research has shown that too. So this again points to a popularity contest rather than the actual strength of the evidence. Another important effect that you may have heard of is what's known as the funding effect. This is when, because of the sources of funding of a study, the actual research itself is pointed in a certain direction, aimed to get certain results, or more likely to produce them, or more likely to be published because more of those studies are showing the same effect, and yet they don't actually necessarily mean that this treatment is better than another treatment. So this is an incredibly important matter. Even pharmaceutical companies that have to spend literally billions to produce a single drug and to get it out to market, even if they're doing things with the very best of intentions, the nature of economics is that they want the drug to succeed, and therefore their starting point is going to be one whereby they choose certain study designs that are more likely to show an effect, and therefore that in itself can introduce a bias into the results themselves. So here's a study from the British Medical Journal, and this goes into looking at 200 clinical trials which were assessed, and it was found that most clinical studies are funded by just one source, but they range to having as many as 12 different sources of funding. And 58% of the studies were funded by the government, 40% were funded by private companies. Around a quarter of that 40% received funding from what were claimed to be not-for-profit organisations. However, when you looked under further investigation, it was found that half of those non-profit organisations were actually in some way linked to profit-driven corporations, again, around half of which were not reported in the published study. Yeah. So what does this mean? Well, it suggests that actually a significant amount of research that's being produced actually has ties to commerce, and therefore just by dint of the fact that the commercial enterprise has to make money in order to succeed, the chances of a result coming out in favor of the treatment is going to be higher, and this skews the perception of the people who receive and watch and read that information. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do want to point out that what this means is that even though it may not be intentional, economics is a significant driver of research, right? Why would you put money, a lot of money, into researching something if you thought that it didn't work in the first place? Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to foot the bill? At the end of the day, somebody needs to buy this medication or device or whatever it is, and they need to see or believe that this thing is actually going to work. So even to the point where we can fool ourselves, it's possible to think that, well, I've done all the best research and therefore this thing works, I believe it, and people who use it are going to believe it, and in the end it doesn't really make a difference to the person's health. So this is a very important factor to take into account. And on that subject, Marcia Angell, she was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. In 2009, she wrote an article, and this was around the time that she actually resigned from the post. And in this article, she said the following: "Similar conflicts of interest and biases exist in virtually every field of medicine, particularly those that heavily rely on drugs or devices. It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I slowly and reluctantly reached over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." So this lady, who has a very reputable career and was the editor of one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, even she was left to arrive at the conclusion that funding sources had a very significant influence on the quality of research and what was actually believable at the end of the day. So this is a pretty worrying and sad state of affairs, actually. I'm a medical doctor. I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, and I have to say that I use my own methods to arrive at the conclusions which I arrive at, and I'll come to that later on in the video. So at this point I want to say and make it very clear that research is incredibly important in medicine. Of course it is, and it's important in every area of life, but we have to be so careful with it. The reporting of research in the press could lead you to believe so many different things about so many different subjects, and even ourselves as scientists, clinicians, struggle to work out what's actually correct and appropriate for our patients. So the important point here is that funding does matter. You've probably heard the expression follow the money. Well, unfortunately, also in scientific research, we have to follow the money to some extent. It doesn't mean that all research that has funding, because all research is funded, is in some way incorrect, but we do need to take it into account when we evaluate the quality of the evidence presented towards us. I want to tell you a little bit about an experience that I had recently, and this was during the COVID pandemic. During this time, of course, it was a new virus. Nobody knew what was going on right from the beginning, and it was not entirely obvious. People were scared. We were being given many different messages from different sources, and we were being told, trust the science, follow the science. Science knows best. Well, those statements are all true. However, science became somewhat politicized, unfortunately, and there were many different interests at play. And I don't want to think that most of these did not, that most of these came from a place that I should be questioning. But I think at the end of the day, there is an economic reality. And again, the more money that's invested into something, the more likely it is that you're going to hear about it. So there's a bias in this in the first place. Now, I want to talk about my experience during the pandemic. Of course, I also read the guidelines of treatments. I also had to try and evaluate what treatments would work. And there were trials being performed at rapid paces and, again, a lot of uncertainty. However, something that I noticed, and quite a number of other doctors I think noticed, was the effect of vitamin D. It seemed to me like there were a lot of doctors, for example, in the UK who were dark-skinned and who were dying. Now, that was one clue. The next clue was that in far sunnier climes, in countries where there was a reasonable amount of sunshine and exposure to the sun, it seemed to me like from the numbers that we were seeing of deaths and people being affected by the virus more severely, that sunshine may have something to do with this. So countries where there was less sunshine, people were experiencing it more. People who were indoors were experiencing the virus in a worse way. And at the time, myself and many other doctors thought that one of the reasons for this could be that people were not getting enough vitamin D. Now, there was no way to prove this at the time. The research hadn't been done, but a number of different doctors started giving their patients vitamin D at pretty good doses. And I'm talking about doses of a few thousand units a day, which sounds like a lot, but actually, if you read the literature, it's not very much, and vitamin D is an incredibly safe supplement to use. I can say from my own personal experience that I didn't have a single patient admitted into hospital during the pandemic, and vitamin D was being advised to everybody, and I was telling people what doses to take. And I know of similar stories from other physicians. At the time, though, people were laughing at this. People were saying, this is ridiculous. How can it be that something as simple as vitamin D could be working for COVID, which was an understandably pretty serious virus with a lot of serious side effects. Even if you got through the infection, there was a good chance you were going to have some kind of injury, such as long COVID, etc. What's happened since, however, is that there's been a lot of really good research that's shown exactly that vitamin D could have saved many, many, many lives and also a lot of people from becoming needlessly sick. So why did that happen? Well, we've spoken about the fact that things that get funding and that are going to be, where there's an interest actually to get this information out, those are the things that people are going to hear about, and they're going to hear about them with the full weight of the research community behind it. Things like vitamin D, which are dirt cheap, which have no patent, and which can actually get for free from the sun, but in reality you need some supplementation, are not going to get the same degree of exposure. And as a result, you're just not going to get the research that you need in time. What does this all mean? Well, I think for myself, it only underlines something that I would love to share with you. And that is that with all the years of practice that I have, with all the knowledge that I've obtained, with all the patients that I've seen, at the end of the day, an individual patient is an individual patient. The statistics, the research can show many different things, but how do I know what is actually correct for the patient sitting in front of me right now? And the answer is, I don't. I have to take the person in front of me, I have to look at the research, I have to consider, is this treatment appropriate for this person? Is this treatment actually working for this person? How well is it working? Do I need to think differently? Could something else work instead of this treatment? Do they need a medication? Do they need a supplement? Do they need a diet? Do they need to sleep more? What do they need? What does this person in front of me need right now? And when do I need to evaluate this again to see how well they're doing? These are the things that can actually drive the most effective way to treat every individual patient. So yes, we have the statistics. We know that these are the drugs used for blood pressure, these are the drugs used for diabetes and whatnot. However, we've got to take a step back and say, hold on a second, there's another factor at play here. How do we optimize this person's health right now? And this is the message that I really want to leave at the end of this video. With all the difficulties in trying to work out what research means, there are so many factors that we can't disentangle everything all the time. And at the end of the day, we use research as a guidance. Guidelines exist as guidelines. They are not the letter of, they're not the word of God. But we need to use them as a framework. And within that framework, we also need to think, hold on a second, does this guideline really apply to this patient? Another thing to really think about with research studies is that the patients in the studies are divided up according to how they do as people who respond, people who don't respond, and people who have side effects. Now, the problem is that in general, the studies use the same dose of medication. So if everyone in a group of, let's say, 100 people is receiving 10 milligrams of a particular drug, and let's say 1/3 of them respond well, 1/3 of them don't respond, and 1/3 of them get side effects. Well, what have we learned from this? It doesn't mean that this drug or supplement, let's say, is ineffective for 60% or thereabouts of the people who have been in this study. What it might mean is that we need to be dosing them differently. So I might need to give 10 milligrams to 1/3 of the patients, 5 milligrams to 1/3, and 15 milligrams to another third. And then we would actually see how effective this medication or treatment is. Another comparison to this, or something similar in the way that we think about things, is when we see a study of, let's say, drug A compared to supplement B. And drug A is given at 500 milligrams twice a day. and supplement B is given at 25 milligrams once a day. And then we see that drug A works and supplement B doesn't. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us only that at these specific doses, this is the thing that worked and this is the thing that didn't work. If we want to be honest and to scrutinize things as much as possible, we need to compare like for like. And this again is an area which we need to be very careful about. Like everything in life, science is not perfect. People like to think science is this incredible box where, these are the answers and we can prove them. We've done an experiment and that's it. But it's not like that in reality. The reality is that it's evolving. It consists of many parts. Our knowledge is changing the whole time. A new piece of knowledge from another area of science comes in and influences things further. Our environment's changing and we need to be able to adapt the whole time. So in conclusion, I'd like to say medicine is not just a science, but it's also an art. The art comes from experience, the art comes from speaking with the patient, listening with the patient, picking up on very subtle cues sometimes, and also similarly with medications that we may or may not prescribe, or other treatments, vitamins, supplements, whatever they be. The idea is to use everything together and not to be literally boxed in and think, well, I'm going to just use this and this is what's supposed to work, and whether it works or not is another matter. I cannot change the whole system, believe it or not. We are fallible human beings, and groupthink and interests can prevail on a large scale. The simplest, cheapest, most ethical, wisest thing to do is to learn how to critically appraise, think, be skeptical, and implement with loyalty to the person in front of me. And therefore, for me to be able to sleep at night in peace. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope you have managed to watch it until this point. I would encourage you to make comments down below, to ask questions. I do my best to try and answer as many of these as possible. And I also hope that you'll subscribe to the channel, because it's going to help me to grow this channel and get such messages out to more and more people, and with the hope that everyone starts becoming better at thinking about their own health, about how to use medicine in the best possible way for their own health. Take care.